All right, so in chapter 6, we're going to focus on primarily communication skills and what that means from the management perspective, how we communicate to people, and how that communication is received. First off, what is communication? Basically, in its basic form, communication is a message that somebody sends, the sender sends to a receiver. That receiver then has to decode that message and process that information, and then they have to encode their response that they want to then send back to the original sender. And so essentially it looks kind of like this. So our sender sends a message to our receiver. The receiver then thinks about it. They have to decode that message. What does that message mean? And then they have to then encode a message and send it back to the original sender. At that point, this person is now the receiver, and so then they have to decode what does that message mean, and then they have to formulate their response, encode their response, and send it back. So it's just this exchange of information, and there's a lot of issues that can come with communication and we want to make sure our communication is effective. That's really what we're going to be talking about throughout this chapter. So first, we communicate only when we want to. Do you think that's true or false? All right, that is false. We're going to talk about these a little bit more in depth. There is such a thing as too much information. True or false? That is true. We communicate mainly with words. True or false? That is definitely false. Words mean the same to both the speaker and the listener. True or false? That is definitely false. Nonverbal communication is silent communication. That is false. Communication is a two-way street between an active speaker and an active listener. True or false? That is definitely true. The message we communicate with is sometimes not the message that the listener receives. True or false? That is true. Here are these 7 different questions that I just asked. These are different myths about communication. And so number 1, I'm going to go through these kind of briefly. We only communicate when we want to communicate, and that's not true. There's a such thing as nonverbal communication. So with our facial expressions, our posture, just our attitude in general, are all those nonverbal communication that send a message to somebody, even when we're not necessarily meaning to communicate. Okay? Words mean the same to both the speaker and the listener. That's not always the case. And so also it also kind of goes back to the basics of vocabulary, and not everybody has the exact same vocabulary, especially if you are dealing with a language barrier, a difference in languages. And so sometimes when we use a word, we might mean something, but then somebody else might see it as something different. And we communicate chiefly with words. That goes kind of back to number 1. The majority of our communication that we do is nonverbal, because that is the way that we send the majority of our messages. And so we want to make sure that our nonverbal communication skills are up to point. Nonverbal communication is silent communication. Okay, so silent communication, not speaking, it kind of sounds weird, but it's actually a form of verbal communication, the absence of the noise. That nonverbal is primarily our facial expressions, our body language, how we present ourselves, all of that is nonverbal communication. Communication is definitely a two-way street, okay? It's a two-way street. You have to have an active listener and an active speaker. And the key word there is active. And active means you're actually involved. And so I've found myself having situations where students will come into my office and I'm finishing up an email and they come into my office and they start talking to me right away. Well, my attention is not on them. I'm not an active listener at that point. And so what I do at that point will say, give me one moment, let me finish this email, and then I can give them my full attention. And that way I can be an active listener and really listen to the message that is being sent. The message we communicate is the message that the listener receives. That's not always true, okay? We can have a situation where we think that we are giving the best news, and I'm telling my boss that I'm really excited, but if my body language is really not enthusiastic or my facial expressions look like I'm bored, then that could send the wrong message. They're going to receive the wrong message. Even though I want to send a message that I'm really excited about being here, then that's going to send the wrong message if our body language is not reflecting the words that we're saying. And then there's no such thing as too much information. That is definitely a myth. Okay, so there is a such thing as too much information. I have been critiqued a few times through my course surveys, and I've kind of tried to limit this. But I've been critiqued as giving too many stories during my lectures. And so because for some people, that's too much information and they're not focused on the actual message that I'm trying to send during the lecture, they're trying to focus on the details of the story. And so that's one thing that I personally have tried to work on through my communication in my lectures to make it more effective. We have three different types of organizational communication. So right here we have an example of a generic organizational chart. Of course, we have the general manager that's going to be up here at the top. That's our GM. And then we have all of our leadership and then all of their team underneath them. Okay. And so if somebody is the general manager needs to get information down to this level here, then we're going to have a downward communication style. Okay. And then now if I need to, if I'm a supervisor and my employee here needs to get in touch with me here, well, they're going to communicate with me in an upward fashion. Now, if I am talking with an employee to employee, actually, let me go back, sorry. If I'm this manager, let's say I'm the front desk manager here, okay? And I need to talk to the housekeeping manager. If I do that, then that is a lateral type of communication, okay? So just think of that. Downward is from the top to the bottom of this organizational chart. Upward is from the bottom to the top. Lateral is talking to somebody at the same level as you. So it could be a server to a server. It could be a server to a bartender. It could be a server to a line cook or the expo. It could be the dining room manager to the kitchen manager. So there's so many different ways that this communication, different either upward, downward, or lateral, this communication can go. So here we go. A bartender expressing their concern to their manager is an example of what type of communication? All right, good. That is upward communication. A manager informing the servers of the specials of the day is an example of downward. So it's the manager talking, passing that information. So we have a couple of different barriers to effective communication. I'm not going to go through every single one of these. I'm going to hit some highlights. So one is the evaluation of the sender. Okay, and so if you go in, let's say you are your manager comes to talk to you, and you really just do not like your manager because you think your manager doesn't like you. You automatically are going to be thinking that that person doesn't like you, so you're not going to really be open to receiving that message. Okay, so that evaluation of that sender your perceived perception of that person is going to affect the way that the message is going to be received. Two different things for that. We have what's called the halo effect and the devil's horn effect. The halo effect is where that you think that person can do no wrong. Everything is so looked at so positively. And so that can essentially affect your evaluation of that person and how communication can be received. And at the same time, too, the devil's horn effect is when the managers hold a negative opinion of that sender. And so if that server or that bartender comes in to talk to you as a manager and you already automatically have a negative image of them, then that's going to affect how well you can receive that message. Defensiveness. What we definitely don't want to do is to put somebody on the defensive. And so as a manager, if you need to talk to somebody and you just say, hey, come to my office, immediately that person's probably thinking, what did I do wrong? And they start thinking about all these things. And then when you're really just kind of asking them to come in, maybe you're going to ask feedback about a process. Maybe you're going to ask them to be on a special project. And you think that you're helping them, grow or helping them have a special skill set so that they can be a part of this project. And the whole time that you're talking to them, they're thinking, oh my gosh, what did I do wrong? And they're already on that defensive mindset. So we definitely don't want to do that. We want to make sure that we send a complete message of, come talk to me in my office. I have a project that I want to put you on. And that automatically puts them into that nice positive mindset of, wow, my manager thinks highly of me to put me on this project. So we definitely don't want to put people on the defensive because that is a huge barrier to effective communication. The environment that we're in can be a barrier to communication. So I'm going to use the perfect example of the kitchen. They're noisy, they're hot, they're loud, and there's things, pots are going on and crashing possibly, and I don't know, there's so much commotion going on. And so if you are across the kitchen and you're doing something unsafe, your chef might yell at you to stop doing what you're doing. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're upset or angry, because that's definitely a message that's communicated with yelling. But it just means they want to get across the room to you to make you stop doing what you're doing so you can keep yourself and your classmates or your employees, your coworkers, safe as well. And so that environment can have a huge barrier to communication. Poor timing. Also, if somebody is really upset about something that just happened, then that's going to be a barrier to that effective communication. So you've always, I don't know if you've ever done this before, but I have a few times. I would write an email exactly saying what I really want to say. And then I just let that email sit there in my draft box. And then I go back and delete it later and rewrite a message once my emotions have calmed down a little bit. Okay, and so that definitely, poor timing can lead to barriers to communication.